Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am TC Ricks, and this is the first in a short series that I'm calling How to Make the 20's Roll. And the idea is that we have an opportunity every 10 years to change the direction of this country, a new decade. And 100 years ago, in 1921, we started what we would arguably consider the first decade in modern America, right? So were there things in that decade that we didn't have previously? Absolutely. Steam power, the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a ton of things that came to be in that decade that we do recognize as synonymous with modern life. For example, radio and the concept of mass media. Film, which had existed previously but boomed in the 1920s. The middle class flourished in the 1920s. Aside from the 1950s, it's probably one of the most prosperous decades in American history. There's a reason they called it the Roaring 20s. Of course, a lot of that boom was built on a speculative bubble, but not all of it, right? A lot of it was consumer culture and the ability to, some of the reforms that were finally put into place by the muckrakers basically made America a much, much better place. And whether or not this decade is something that we can benefit from the fruits of the labor of the past, or something where we finally take a step forward, there's a certain series of simple things that we can do that will help us move into the 21st century. I have a lot of really good ideas in another series I did called 11 Fixes for a Broken Everything. But this is different. And specifically speaking, I'm going to be talking about 5 things that absolutely must happen for us to move forward. And I'm going to start with the most simple, which is that if we do not get a new constitution, we are going nowhere, right? If you like the idea of the Model T or the motor car which had existed before 1920, but was certainly popular with the Model T and became mass consumed in the 20s. You're not going anywhere without an engine. And while an entire society is not dependent on its government, a society without a functional government cannot arbitrate between business disputes or individuals, cannot properly enforce laws or cultural norms, cannot shape culture in a way that encourages a healthy environment, vibrant society. And in short, basically, you are not going anywhere. There's a lot of people who've been talking about constitutional reform for the better part of, since forever, for various reasons. Now, you've probably heard a lot of people talk about amending the Constitution or fixing the Constitution, and if you've ever looked into it, it's not an easy thing, right? It's only happened a few times in American history, and it's usually to fix something that's like majorly broken. It basically happens if, somebody else needs the vote, or, a major crisis happens, or FDR is elected 4 times and the Republicans have a hissy fit, stuff like that. To amend the Constitution, you basically need to have 2/3 of the House of each Congress, or of each House of Congress, ratified by 3/4 of the states, or you can have a constitutional convention with 3/4 of the states. And this has been tried, this latter has been tried numerous times and never really succeeded. There's no statute of limitations on it, right? So theoretically, the balanced budget amendment, which has been tried by a number of states, could have it happen. But, there's lots of people who are terrified about that happening because they're worried that suddenly the conservatives are going to put in every single anti-abortion, anti-woman, anti-minority, abolish the House of Representatives. Who knows what crazy things that they would put in, right? And those fears are justified. But as far as the American Constitution is concerned, those changes still have to be ratified by the actual states, and that's the thing that people forget. And good luck getting 3/4 of the states to agree on a constitution, and then good luck getting them to agree on ratifications for a bunch of crazy conservative crap, right? It's not going to happen. So when we're talking about fixing the Constitution with a new Constitution, get the crazy people who are worried about suddenly living in a Handmaid's Tale out of your head, okay? If you've actually seen The Handmaid's Tale, you understand that that did not happen because of a constitutional convention, which is fictional, by the way. That happened because they of a coup d'etat. They took power. Same thing with the man in the high castle, right? The American Reich in that government was not because of a lawful transfer of power. So to have some nightmare conservative regime in this country, you're going to have a scenario where in 75% of the states, all of a sudden, a bunch of non-white, non-male people think it's a great idea to make white male Anglo-Saxon Protestant individuals the only people who can vote in this country. Yeah, sure, I had the vote, but I just felt that people who like Fox News should have it instead, so I'm going to vote. I mean, what kind of crazy planet do you live on, right? Now, on the other side of the coin, you have incrementalists who basically dismiss any attempt to change the Constitution as, nope, it can't happen because, the Constitution. And that's a very clever trap that has been created by centrists and incrementalists about basically preventing us from getting a new Constitution, but ignores a very, very important fact. This is going to sound crazy, but bear with me. The South was right in the Civil War, right? And to be clear, I am not talking about slavery. Slavery is morally wrong and morally reprehensible. I am talking about the fact that in the Constitution, there's this thing called the 10th Amendment, which very clearly says that if it's not written in the Constitution, then that power belongs to the states. And also bear in mind that I am both a generalist and a modernist in terms of I do believe in a living document, a living constitution that can be broadly interpreted to suit the needs of its people. But I'm also somebody who can read the freaking thing, and if it very clearly says, if it ain't here, it's a state power, and there's nothing, let me repeat, nothing in the Constitution about seceding. Nothing. Therefore, if a state chooses to secede, it is still the purview of that state government to do so. Now, in practical reality, the federal government has the actual power by right of law, by right of might, rather than right of arms, to invade that new country and make it part of the United States again, right? So in practical reality, a state can't secede just because it wants to. But legally speaking, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, it's right there in the Constitution. And if that's the case, then it's time we also remember that just because the Constitution says that it takes 3/4 of the states to form a constitutional convention, which, by the way, still has to be approved by the corrupt Congress, doesn't mean we can't get a constitution. Because there's another part of the Constitution that a lot of people forget, and it's called We, the people of the United States of America. Currently, the United States bases its power on states. That's the basic legal construct of the United States. In most every other country in the world, not every, but most every other country in the world, especially republics, those governments legally base their sovereignty on the power of its people, right? In other words, we, the people of this country, declare our sovereignty and our commitment to form a government, and here is the basis of that government. Our Constitution was the pattern by which many other democracies established their written constitutions. We're not the oldest democracy. England has had a constitution for a long time, but they take pride in the fact that it's not written down, right? There are founding documents to the English system, such as the Magna Carta, and many things that they would call like a basic law or, founding laws. But the fact of the matter is that there's not one single document that explains this is the British Constitution, this is the executive, this is the legislative, etc., 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 right? Now, very briefly, I'm going to make the case for a new constitution for those who are not already convinced due to the Electoral College, which will be number one on my list of why we need to fix this. There are a lot of things that need to be fixed in the Constitution, more than one, more than a single amendment going through the lengthy, labyrinthine, and frankly, unscrupulous amendment process that basically makes it very difficult to fix things that are now recognized as rights, especially by people in cities as rights, such as a right to health care, such as a right to the internet, right? Most people who live in cities consider these things rights, but not all Americans do. And passing a constitutional amendment saying that we have a right to the internet is going to be an uphill battle. However, the Electoral College is self-evident to anyone who lives in a city of just how unfair that somebody in Wyoming gets 8 times more voting power than I do in the federal government. And the counter-argument that, well, presidential candidates would never stop in Wyoming. How often do they stop in Wyoming anyway? Now, okay, they stop in larger states like the Midwest that they might otherwise ignore. But, to be honest, all of our wealth is in cities. All of our current economic talent is in cities. Cities are where everything changes, and more importantly, there are more people in cities, right? So the fact of the matter is that while it's okay to protect the minority in a representative democracy, and is good to, so that tyranny of the majority doesn't destroy the minority, there is no ethical case, let me repeat this, there is no ethical case where it is acceptable to put the democratic sovereign rights of one individual over another when you're basing your entire legal foundation on that. In other words, we the people sets out a promise. It's not we the rich white landowning slave owners, or we the white people, or we the rural areas of Wyoming and the rest of the country that when you look at a map sure looks like, the vast majority of the population supports Republicans and Trump, even though when you look at a population graph, that ain't the case, right? So the fact of the matter is that if you're deriving your sovereignty from your infinite and awesome potential as a human being, and the idea that on a certain legal level we should all be equal, especially in opportunity, even if it's not in result, then the idea that somebody in Wyoming has more rights than me when they didn't do anything to earn them except live in Wyoming is evil. It's just flat out evil. And to be honest, there is more disparities than the Electoral College that need to be solved. The Senate is a problem. The Senate is a real problem. It is undemocratic. It is unproductive. It is one of the least productive legislative bodies in the world. It is infested by bad ideas and has stood in the way of progress again and again and again. And what many people describe as a break on unreasonable change are the same people that defended slavery or defended the McCarthy hearings in the 50s or defended absolutely crazy, crazy things that the conservatives want to do. So I'm sorry, I'm done with the Senate and I'm done with the Electoral College. So that's my first argument for why we need a new constitution. The second argument for why we need a new constitution is that there is just vile language in there, put there by vile men, even though I have great respect for many of the founders of this country. Many of them were slave owners. And even some of the ethical ones, the ones that were in every other way basically really good human beings, still own slaves. Before you talk to me about how great the founding fathers were, read a book on the treatment by the white descendants of Thomas Jefferson, by the black descendants of Thomas Jefferson, and how they weren't unwilling to recognize their paternity until there was a genetics test, and they were legally forced to only a couple decades ago. Or read Never Caught, about the slave of George Washington who ran away and who was constantly haunted by George Washington and his wife trying to find her, while he's doing all these other great patriotic things that help build real democracy in this country, for which I have a great deal of respect. Or read So the fact is that the 3/4 compromise alone is built right there in the Constitution, and an amendment is just going to strike the language. It's not going to remove the language. In other words, slavery should not belong in a constant modern constitution, and simply amending it is like putting a Band-Aid on a giant mound of human excrement and putting it on a white marble pedestal that is the greatest artwork that your society can produce. It's just dumb, right? This is the document that is supposed to bring us together. This is the document that we might agree to disagree on things like taxes or education or religion or any number of things, but at least we can agree on how we're going to resolve those differences and what we need to do to go forward. And by the way, how's the Constitution doing about that right now, right? Oh, you can make the argument that we basically passed the popular president, and he's popularly elected president, and he's on track to be elected. But in 2016, the popularly elected president was not elected. Again, that does go back to the Electoral College, but the Republicans have won way too many times. And again, it's not just the Senate, and it's not just the Electoral College. There are lots of little ways that the Constitution is designed literally from the ground up for rich, white, slave-owning men. And it's time to go. Finally, my biggest argument for why we need to a new Constitution is California is one of the most prosperous areas of the country. And in part, not in its entirety, but in part, that is thanks to a robust and easy amendment process. And there are a lot of people who are not fans of the amendment process in the West, in Western states, where you only need a 50%, or at least not much higher than that percentage, to amend the Constitution. But the fact of the matter is, you can always counter a bad amendment with another amendment. right? And the fact of the matter is that, yes, there are some bad amendments in California. There's an amendment that the Republicans got passed several decades ago that is ruining local tax bases in California and making it very hard for certain things like education to happen. But California is still so rich that its GDP as a state exceeds that of many European countries. And yes, it's also a big state. But let's remember that in terms of states that contribute to the federal budget versus states that take from it, the only two red states that basically actually have a net contribution are Florida and Texas. And Florida just recently became a red state. And Texas is rapidly becoming a blue one, or at least a purple state. So and frankly, if it weren't for crazy cartoon gerrymandering, that would have happened a while ago. And it's actually because the states are so rogue on certain things that there are inherent things built into the way states are allowed to do things that they should not be allowed to do, like gerrymandering at all. Elections need to be a federal thing. And, you're going to make the argument, well, what if Trump took power? Well, a properly designed federal government would never have allowed Trump to take power in the first place. And there are ways to prevent that from happening. Because remember, Trump was not popularly elected. So anytime you're going to use the word Trump in an election situation, you're going to have to explain to me how Trump could have been elected with a proper European constitution in the first place, right? And am I going to say that European constitutions are the only way we should go? No. But there's no constitution in Europe that I'm aware of that Trump would have been elected, much less reelected. Now, Europe's got some problems, and there are some societies in Europe, such as Hungary and Poland, that I would definitely not want to emulate. But it's been real hard for the fascists to take over Poland. They've had to try it multiple times, and they have a much, much less robust tradition of democracy than we do in this country. And Hungary, well, let's just say they were dumb enough to allow a mogul to buy up all of the media. And frankly, anyway, like I said, I could go on and on about Hungary, and at some point I will. But that's not what I'm discussing in this particular podcast episode, right? So I've made arguments for revising the Constitution, and I've made arguments for the fact that a single amendment process isn't going to work. But you've also heard me say that Article 5 is not enough. And I stand by that statement. It's too hard to do. And more importantly, frankly, it can't be ratified, and the conservatives are insane, right? They're just insane. They're anti-democratic fascists who got to go. And by go, I mean they need to be locked out of the political process such that until they revolt, in which case they are to be lawfully and legally treated as anybody who picks up guns against society at large. In terms of how we govern a sane society by the rights of the majority, we need to bypass them. And frankly, that means bypassing the United States Constitution. So I want you to think back to 1787, when the extremely weak, by design, Articles of Confederation were created. And basically, they had the people who were looking at this situation and looking at how weak and ineffective the Articles of Confederation was the government that we had before our current government, between when we got independence from the British, when the Revolutionary War ended, and the United States Constitution was ratified. We had this really deliberately weak government that the colonies put together because they were worried about a tyrannical government. And they realized that it was too weak, and it basically required total union from all the states, and they were way too competitive with each other. And there were all kinds of things that weren't getting done, like if there was a dispute between states, there was no way to settle it. There was no Supreme Court. The executive basically had no power. It couldn't tax. It couldn't do a lot of things. So we created the federal system with the United States Constitution. But the thing you have to remember is that when they originally set this thing up, right, officially speaking, they did not actually send a bunch of people from the states to actually update and create a new government. They created it with the idea of fixing the United States Constitution. And the fact of the matter is that when you understand the basic concept that sovereignty is based on individuals, I'm going to make the basic argument that, and again, I know this is going to sound crazy, but like I said, we live in an age of the internet. So before I talk about how, let me talk about what. I believe that we can create a constitution in the United States based directly on the will of the people rather than the government at large. And that all this technically requires is a president to not send the military in and stop it. Yeah, you heard that right. What I'm saying is that instead of having an Article 5 convention that will never pass red state legislatures, all we need to do is have the majority of this country, which is to say the cities, and by cities I do mean cities in red states as well, such as Atlanta and Kansas City, and the capitals of each red state, and, Houston and Austin and New York and Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, right? The cities of the United States of America, to basically send representatives to discuss creating a new constitution. Now, if a state government is blue, and the rural areas of that blue state government want to be represented, then they are welcome to do so if the state legislatures decide to get in on the process. But if you are a red state, like Florida or Texas, you can be represented by your cities, by your blue cities. And you can also be represented by blue cities if, for example, you have a corrupt but still democratic state legislature in states like New York, where reform has been snarled due to a really corrupt constitution there too for decades, for centuries. So my point is that as long as you have enough legitimacy to have a sense that this constitution is being created by a wide swath of society, and then that constitution is ratified directly by the majority of the population of the United States by mail-in voting, we don't need to have a constitution that is put together by a constitutional process according to the Constitution. All we need is a president to sit by and not crush it. It's that simple. We created the original Constitution without 2/3 of the states coming together and agreeing to have a constitutional convention. We had 55 representatives that were sent there to fix the damn thing. One of the states, Rhode Island, wasn't even initially represented. And they basically all came together and used their street cred as the founding fathers and representatives of the actual state governments to create a United States Constitution. City governments are legitimate. They are actual governments that people believe in the sovereignty of. Now, to be clear, what I'm saying is there are basically two obstacles in the creation of a government, right? The first one is legitimacy, and the second one is sovereignty. So when it comes to legitimacy, the Constitution and the federal government don't have a lot of legitimacy with a large chunk of the United States on both sides of the political spectrum. On the right, you have basically a cartoon Fox News reality that makes them no longer viable partners in the creation of a new constitution. And on the left, you have a bunch of people that realize that they don't have an equal say with fucking Wyoming, right? So we can all agree that there's definitely a crisis in legitimacy with the United States federal government. And Biden might be a great president. I don't know. But he's going to be governing at best with a 50-50 division in the Senate. And he's going to have to go hat in hand where any single Democratic senator can prevent a ratification of a treaty or can prevent the nomination of a judge or can prevent the nomination of a cabinet member. That's cartoon. That's just garbage. There's nothing about that even in the Constitution itself. It just says, by the advice and consent of the Senate, shall cabinet members serve, right? And so the point is that that's yet another reason why the Constitution is a piece of garbage. It was great 250 years ago. We've gotten a lot of mileage out of it. It saved us at least one last time against Trump, but it's got to go. It's got to go. And the way we do that is legitimacy by other means, i.e. instead of state governments and instead of the federal government, we take local governments, cities, or in certain cases in rural areas so that they can be represented from blue states, or hell, even red states that are intelligent enough to understand which way the wind is blowing, and a president who agrees that this can happen. That's it. All the president has to do is tell the army, you're not going to go in and arrest all of these people as they have a constitutional convention. That's it. That's all it takes. Because what happens then is they pass a constitution. We have a bunch of people come together, build a constitution, build it without the crazy people, with all the people that want to make abortion illegal and, make women not have the right to vote. And then we ratify it. And as long as we make it so that instead of saying 2/3 of the state like it took to ratify the original Constitution, you basically say if the majority of the population of the United States ratifies this Constitution, it will become the new dominant law of the land. Full stop. You immediately bypass the Article 5 Convention. You immediately bypass the problem of conservative nightmare people being involved in it. You have a new Constitution in the United States of America that is fair, that is democratic, that represents the actual interests of the majority of the people in the United States of America, and belongs in the 21st century, and that doesn't mention slavery. It's a win-win for anybody who's not a right-wing crook. So there you have it. There's a how, there's a why, and there's a what. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2020.
To fight the forces of evil!